Another day of drama as the ramifications of last week's Leave vote continue to sink in here and in Brussels. Hello and welcome to Scotland 2016. David Cameron meets EU leaders in Brussels. They tell him if you're leaving, then get on with it. Nicola Sturgeon goes there tomorrow to explore all Scotland's post-Brexit options. Could there be a way forward with Gibraltar? And it all gets a whole lot more awkward for Jeremy Corbyn as he loses a vote of no confidence by his own MPs. The First Minister will be in Brussels tomorrow to meet European Parliament President Martin Schulz. Earlier at Holyrood, Nicola Sturgeon secured the backing of MSPs to begin talks on exploring options for a place for Scotland in the EU. It came as the Scottish Parliament debated the Brexit vote for the first time. But there were also claims Ms Sturgeon was trying to steer the country towards a second referendum on Scottish independence. Andrew Black reports.
Extraordinary times often call for extraordinary measures. Proceedings at Holyrood began with the presiding officer saying he was ready to recall Parliament from its summer holidays if required.
This is the first opportunity we have had to come together since the monumental events of last week. The consequences of the EU referendum for Scotland are clearly complex and will take some time to fully emerge. I'm determined that the Parliament is able to play a full role in this process.
Then the First Minister rose to her feet to express disappointment and concern at the vote for Britain to leave the EU despite Scotland's majority view to remain. And she said that while a second independence referendum wasn't currently her number one option, it was still on the table.
Based on the very clear result in Scotland, if we were to be removed from the EU, it would be against the will of our people. That would be democratically unacceptable. It is for that reason that I have said that everything must be on the table to protect our place in Europe, including a second independence referendum, and to ensure that the option of holding a referendum within the timeframe of UK negotiations on leaving the EU is viable. We will prepare the legislation now.
But the Conservatives' Ruth Davidson said the First Minister had an ulterior motive.
Within hours of the vote becoming clear on Friday morning, the Scottish Government had pushed questions of independence front and centre. I cannot ignore the First Minister's Dover House announcement that she'd already instructed government officials to start drawing up the necessary legislation for a second referendum on independence.
And the Labour leader turned her anger back towards Ruth Davidson.
Anger at a party that forced this EU referendum on a country that did not want it, only to resolve an ego contest in the Tory party.
Liberal Democrat leader Willie Rennie was equally scathing about the Conservatives.
The economic chaos means the Tories can never again claim to be the defenders of the economy. And after the surge in the support for independence at the weekend, nor can the Tories claim to be the defenders of the Union.
Patrick Harvey from the Greens argued the result of the last independence referendum had now been superseded and gave his backing to another one.
People who voted in 2014 did so on a false prospectus, a false promise that their membership of the European Union would be protected in those circumstances, and it has not been.
Despite today's exchanges on independence, MSPs ultimately voted by a majority to mandate the First Minister to, as they put it, protect Scotland's relationship with the European Union. Nicola Sturgeon will travel to Brussels tomorrow to begin the process of seeking a solution. But if none is found, Scotland may well have to get ready for another referendum, this time on whether Scotland should leave the UK.
Well, joining me now are some MSPs who took part in that debate. From Dundee, Conservative MSP Murdo Fraser, and in Edinburgh, Labour's Lewis MacDonald, and for the SNP, Richard Lochhead. Welcome to all of you this evening. Richard Lochhead, the First Minister's off to Brussels tomorrow. I mean, it's clear from the standing ovation there was some warmth for Scotland's position there. But realistically, what can she achieve?
Well, as Parliament gave a mandate to the First Minister today to do, she's wanting to speak up for Scotland, because after last week's monumental result, with a situation where Scotland voted to stay in Europe because it's so important to our country's future, but elsewhere in the UK, of course, the result went leave, and now we face a very anxious time ahead. And it was really good, very encouraging to see the opposition parties, except the Conservatives, rallying round together to say that Scotland has to act. We give a mandate to our First Minister and the Scottish Government to go and find a route to maintain a relationship with Europe, because that's the democratic will of the Scottish people. At this stage, we have to look at all the options. That was what was discussed today at the Parliament. And we've been speaking, as you know, to other parts of the UK that voted to stay in Europe, like Northern Ireland and Gibraltar. And of course, we want to continue that dialogue, and we'll explore absolutely all options, because the outcome that most of the political parties in the Parliament want to see, reflecting the will of the Scottish people, is maintaining that relationship with Europe to protect our economy, our society, and it's the kind of country we want to be.
Well, Lewis MacDonald, you supported the First Minister in her request for a mandate to pursue talks. How far will your support go?
Well, what we asked the First Minister to do as a Parliament today was to go and explore all the options and to find out whether there was a route that would allow Scotland to maintain its relationship with the EU and our place in the single market. I think that's a very clear direction which she will take forward and report back to Parliament.
And if she comes back, having explored all the options and says that nothing short of independence will keep Scotland within the EU, would you then support a second independence referendum?
Well, Labour's position has never been to support that, but what we do want is to explore what options there might be. And clearly we need to take into consideration what the report back from that exploration is. But it would be a mistake, and the First Minister was very clear in her contribution in the Parliament, it would be a mistake to say that this was simply a ruse to set up an independence referendum. She was very clear that she was genuinely seeking other possible ways forward, and we encourage her to do that.
Well, Murdo Fraser, do you agree that it would be democratically unacceptable for Scotland to be taken out of the EU against its will?
What the vote last Thursday was about was whether the United Kingdom should remain part of the EU or not. And people in Scotland were voting on that proposition, not a proposition about Scotland alone. And you know, I've been deluged, even in the last few hours, my email inbox has had dozens of emails from constituents who voted Remain in the vote last Thursday, who are outraged that Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP are somehow taking that vote to Remain as a mandate for a second independence referendum, because they're making the position very clear that they are supporters of the United Kingdom. They voted for the UK to remain in the EU. They are, like me, disappointed in the outcome of that referendum, but they don't believe that gives the SNP a mandate to pursue a second independence referendum, or even for that matter these negotiations in Europe. It's an important point. You know, we all agree, and Ruth Davidson made this clear today, we want to deal with the EU, we want to keep access to the single market for British businesses and Scottish businesses, if at all possible. But that needs to be agreed on a UK-wide basis for the best deal for the UK.
So even if the First Minister comes back with an assurance that Scotland could remain in the EU if it was to vote for independence, you would stick with the rest of the UK out of Europe?
There is no mandate for another independence referendum. We've just been through two very divisive and bitter referendum campaigns, one last week on the membership of the EU, one 2 years ago on Scotland's place in the Union. The last thing people of Scotland need is another bitter and divisive referendum. And you know, at a time when we're seeing instability in the economy and political instability in the UK, we don't need to add to that instability with yet another referendum on independence. We need cool heads and calm reflection.
Richard Lochhead, there's no mandate for a second independence referendum.
Well, Murdo seems to be ignoring the result of the referendum in Scotland, where overwhelmingly people in this country voted to
UK
stay in
referendum.
Europe. And Murdo is a member of Scotland's national parliament because we're a country, we're a nation with our own national parliament. And people are looking to our national parliament to show leadership. And we're certainly getting no leadership from the UK parties in London, particularly the Conservative Party who got us into this mess in the first place. And the people of Scotland want the Scottish Government and our national parliament and MSPs like Murdo and myself and Lewis to get Scotland out of this mess that the Conservative Government put us into in the first place. That's why we have a national parliament, to discuss national questions and represent the Scottish national interest. And in anyone's book, and I think the majority of people in Scotland agree with this is such a big issue for Scotland's future, is a material change in circumstances. And of course, that's what we've always said, that if there was to be another referendum in the future, and that turned out to be the only option for giving us a chance to stay in Europe, that of course is a material change in circumstances, given the vote in Scotland.
Before we go, Lewis MacDonald, I'd just like to ask you just about the Labour Party before we go. Kezia Dugdale says it is difficult now for Jeremy Corbyn to continue as Labour leader. Do you think it's time for him to resign?
I think that difficulty is obvious. I think he will sleep on it. It is clearly a very difficult position for anyone to lead their party if their own immediate colleagues do not have confidence in them. I think the critical thing here, and we've been talking in the last few minutes about the position with Brexit, one of the possible outcomes of all of that is a general election across the UK. Clearly Labour will want to be in a position to challenge the Tories, because it is the Tories who have created this mess. It is the Tories who are responsible for it. They need to be challenged. That, I think, is principally Labour's job. And I think Jeremy Corbyn and everybody else will have to think very seriously about how best we can do that.
There we must leave it, I'm afraid. Lewis MacDonald, Murdo Fraser, Richard Lochhead. Well, perhaps an unlikely ally in exploring ways to stay in the European Union is the tiny British overseas territory of Gibraltar. It's emerged that Gibraltar has entered into talks with Scotland to discuss the possibility of staying part of the EU. Fabian Picardo, the territory's chief minister, says he's speaking to Nicola Sturgeon about the potential options for both countries. The territory backed to remain with a massive 95% mandate. A short while ago, I spoke to Alan Trench, who's an academic and writer on devolution. So is this just wishful thinking by Gibraltar's First Minister, or could Scotland, Northern Ireland, Gibraltar negotiate together to actually stay in the EU?
I'm afraid that it pretty much is. The European Union is first and foremost a union of member states, and parts of those states are parts of the European Union because they're parts of the states. I can't think of a single case where it would be possible to be a part of something that isn't a member state but somehow in the European Union. You can do things the other way around. There are cases such as the Faroe Islands where they're part of a member state but the European Union law doesn't in whole or in part apply there. But the idea that you can opt in but the member state is not a member state is really strange.
So do you think that there's another way that Scotland could remain in the EU without being a full member state?
Well, one possibility is the sort of deal that's currently being talked about, the sort of Norway-type deal to remain in the European Economic Area, but not to be part of the European Union. So Scotland would still have most of the advantages of being part of the European Union, but wouldn't, of course, even through the UK, have any entitlement to participate in proceedings of the Council of Ministers, send members to the European Parliament and so on. Otherwise, I can't see any way at all. Either Scotland is a part of the United Kingdom, in which case it appears it may not be part of the European Union, or it may, by becoming independent, it could remain part of the European Union, but at the price of severing its links with other parts of the United Kingdom.
This situation is unprecedented, though, and we saw earlier today standing ovation for the SNP in Brussels. I mean, might there be a willingness to take a new approach, given the circumstances?
I'm doubtful about that, but in any case, that's a degree of innovative constitutional thinking that I don't think the European Union would be capable of, nor I suspect would there be much political willingness to go down that route. And to make an exception for certain parts of a member state, given all that's going on at the moment. I mean, the European Union has many other urgent matters it's got to deal with as well. This is a huge complication for the Union and its institutions and member states to deal with at the present time.
So you think all roads really lead back to a second Indy referendum if Scotland wants to remain in Europe?
I suspect so. I should add that I think there might be an option for Gibraltar, though the Chief Minister might not thank me for pointing it out, and that's co-sovereignty through Spain, and to remain a member state of part of the European Union through being a part of Spain rather than part of the United Kingdom.
Well, with Scotland, we heard the former Belgian Prime Minister saying an independent Scotland could stay in the EU without having to go to the back of the queue of countries looking to join. How do you think that will go down with other countries like Spain?
That's an interesting proposition. There are a great many complexities, and you're quite right that Spain may feel very uneasy about that, particularly if Mariano Rajoy remains the Prime Minister. And is determined to do all he can to prevent Catalan independence and to make the life of the Catalans as difficult as possible if they opt for independence. Scotland, of course, has several advantages, as it always had, including at the time of the referendum in 2014. It satisfies what's called the acquis communautaire already, because the UK is a member state. It is in compliance with European Union law in the aspects of how Scotland works. So it would be in a very ready position to negotiate independence. The question is whether it has to make a formal application or counts as part of a member state that somehow is leaving. As you say, these are unprecedented circumstances. No one quite really knows what the procedures are and how all the member states and all the complexities of European politics will work.
Well, just briefly, what about the UK's position now? Boris Johnson says there'll continue to be free trade and access to the single market. How likely is that, in your view?
Well, we will see. I suspect it's much more difficult than Boris Johnson wants to give the impression that it is. And if that were the goal, I think you might have run the referendum campaign, the Leave side of the referendum campaign, rather differently. A lot of hard words were spoken about the nature of the European Union during the campaign by those supporting an out vote, and those words won't be forgotten by other member states.
Alan Trench in London, thanks very much. To Brussels now, where David Cameron has just given a press conference. He said his final summit with other EU leaders was a positive, calm and constructive meeting. He said there was a tone of sadness and regret at Britain's decision to leave the EU, but there was a universal respect for the decision among European leaders. He said Britain wouldn't turn its back on Europe, and he hoped the closest possible relationship could be negotiated outside the EU. Meanwhile, in the European Parliament earlier today, UKIP leader and Leave campaigner Nigel Farage was booed, and the SNP MEP Alan Smith made an impassioned plea on behalf of Scotland. Our political correspondent Glenn Campbell has this report.
Coming together to work out how best to part. As David Cameron arrived in Brussels for Brexit talks with EU leaders, the European Parliament was debating the UK's decision to withdraw, with one Scottish representative highlighting the Remain vote in Scotland and appealing to MEPs for help to maintain Scotland's EU links.
Now, colleagues, there is a lot of things to be negotiated. We will need cool heads and warm hearts. But please remember this. Scotland did not let you down. Please, I beg you, chers collègues, do not let Scotland down now.
And outside the chamber, this former Belgian Prime Minister, who's meeting Nicola Sturgeon tomorrow, backed continuing EU membership for Scotland if it votes for independence.
If they decide to be independent, they decide to be independent. So, and if they want then to stay into the European Union, they can stay into the European Union. It's their decision.
Stay in without having to join a queue to get in?
Yeah, they are in for the moment, so there's no problem on that side.
Absolute majority.
But this analyst, who is now advising the Scottish Government on Brexit, thinks some EU member states would be nervous about Scottish independence.
So it's especially a country like Spain with a secessionist movement in Catalonia, in the Basque country, but also in other countries around Europe where you have regions which at least have a tendency towards secessionism, so for example Belgium.
The First Minister's made clear she's prepared to explore all options to protect Scotland's relationship with the European Union, including independence. She's seeking direct talks with the governments and institutions of the EU and they'll begin here in Brussels tomorrow when Nicola Sturgeon comes to the Parliament to meet its President, Martin Schulz, amongst others.
Glenn Campbell there. Well, Tara Palmieri is a reporter for Politico Europe, and she joins me now from our Brussels studio. Good evening, Tara. Now, you've just hot-footed it from the Prime Minister's press conference, I understand. What did he have to say?
He said that he had a lot of sadness and regret at this final European Council, which I think is code for he basically had to say he was sorry to all of these prime ministers for, first of all, putting them through an extremely torturous night, figuring out a UK settlement, months of having to walk on eggshells, and then to finally come back with a vote of no confidence in the EU, I guess you would say. And so it was kind of a somber moment. At the end, though, he answered in the question saying that the reason that the UK people voted to leave the EU is because of migration from Europe. So he did give his thoughts, his feeling of why they voted to leave.
And I understand from some reports he was actually calling for reforms on freedom of movement in Europe. I wonder how will that go down there?
Right, it's kind of hard to ask for change after you've already left, right? So we'll see how that goes down. But the truth is that Euroscepticism is growing all over the EU. And if they want to contain this contagion of anti-EU feelings, then they need to actually take these concerns into account.
Well, we've heard a lot of tough talking today in Brussels, perhaps most significantly from the German Chancellor. Are attitudes like that likely to soften over the coming weeks and months?
I think they are going to soften. I think a lot of people were actually just very emotional from the results, especially those who are federalists and believe in the European project and see it as almost the United States of Europe. So those people were especially crushed. It was to them like losing a state. So that group, yes, they may have used that emotion of sadness and kind of diverted it into a vengeful feeling to diffuse any sort of, like I said, contagion of Euroscepticism that's moving around Europe. So what we have right now, though, is a really fragile political situation in France, one of the core founders of the EU, where the National Front is polling at 28%, higher than the current sitting president, Francois Hollande. And they're also asking for a EU referendum on membership. So this is obviously going to be an issue throughout Europe. You have it in the Netherlands, they're calling for a referendum, Czech Republic, and I'm sure this will be the topic of conversation for months and years to come unless there's serious talk about how to change the European Union.
Scotland's First Minister arrives in Brussels tomorrow. We saw a standing ovation for SNP MEP today in the Chamber. Do you get a sense that there's widespread support for trying to find a way to keep Scotland within the EU, even if the rest of the UK leaves?
I'm not sure that that's a priority right now. I do think what they're really genuinely thinking about is how to diffuse the political uncertainty right now in the UK. So Scotland just throws in a whole new factor and, frankly, even more uncertainty. I'm sure that obviously the idea that Scotland has solidarity with the EU helps their cause, which shows that the European project is important and useful and people want to be a part of it. They don't want to leave. But at the same time, I think right now the focus is on triggering Article 50, trying to quell the uncertainty throughout Europe, and then I guess perhaps looking to Scotland. Okay. I think, though, it would be if
I'm afraid there we're going to have to leave it. Tara Palmieri, thank you very much in Brussels. Thank you. Now, Labour MPs have backed a motion of no confidence in their party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, by 172 votes to 40. It's thought a challenge to his leadership could emerge as early as tomorrow. Meanwhile, the Conservatives have announced that their leadership contest has been put back until September the 9th. To tell us more about all of this, here's our Westminster correspondent, Nick Eardley. Hello, Nick. It's all happening down there. As the days go by, it couldn't really be much worse for Jeremy Corbyn, could it?
No, Shelley, I don't think there's any doubt now that there's a war for the heart and the future of the Labour Party taking place in Westminster at the moment. Jeremy Corbyn's standing firm tonight. There's no sign he's going anywhere, despite the fact that 80% of the Parliamentary Labour Party said earlier today that they no longer have any confidence in him. And one of the voices questioning just how he could continue, how he could stay on in the job with so little support in Parliament was Scottish Labour leader Kezia Dugdale. Here's what she told BBC Scotland a little earlier.
I'm the leader of the Scottish Labour Party. I took on this job around about the same time that Jeremy Corbyn was elected UK leader. We went through a similar process and we have a similar mandate. I have 72% of the party membership in Scotland behind me. But if I had just lost 80% of my parliamentary colleagues, I simply could not do my job. And I think it's now extremely difficult for Jeremy Corbyn to continue.
Mr Corbyn, though, points out that he still has, he thinks, substantial support within the membership of the Labour Party. He says that he won't betray those who elected him by standing down. But a sign of just how difficult it could be for him to remain in the role comes in the Scottish context, and the question over who will replace Ian Murray as the shadow Scottish Secretary. I was speaking to Lord Foulkes. He chairs the Scottish Parliamentary Labour Party here at Westminster, and he said none of the peers would be prepared to take that job whilst Jeremy Corbyn is still the leader. And obviously Labour only has one Scottish MP. So there are a number of roles where Jeremy Corbyn can't find people to fill shadow cabinet positions at the moment. The SNP saying today that's not good enough. They want that role filled as soon as possible. I fully expect that there will be a leadership contest now. Labour MPs are taking soundings tonight about who might want to stand against Jeremy Corbyn, who might be the best person to defeat him. The two names that keep coming up today from Labour sources, Tom Watson, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, and Angela Eagle, who until yesterday was the Shadow Business Minister.
Well, of course, the leadership election all eyes are on at the moment is for the Conservative Party. They're hoping to have somebody new in place by the 2nd of September. Where's the smart money going?
Well, tomorrow, Shelley, those nominations open, and I think we'll start to see some of the focus shift from Labour to the Conservatives, the next Conservative leader, the person who will, of course, be the next Prime Minister. Boris Johnson is the favourite. He's the person that everybody at Westminster expects to stand with the backing of fellow Brexiteer Michael Gove. But there's some momentum building, I think, for a Stop Boris candidate. The person who's been mentioned over the road in Parliament today has been Theresa May. Of course, she supported remaining in the EU, but she wasn't particularly vocal about that, so she might be somebody that Conservative MPs on the Brexit side are a bit more happy about. Some other names in the frame tonight: Liam Fox, the former Defence Secretary, a Scot, of course. He's somebody we expect to put his name forward tomorrow. Also, Stephen Crabb, the Inverness-born minister, is expected to stand with Sajid Javid as his number 2.
Okay.
And we'll get more details on exactly who's standing, I think, tomorrow.
OK, thanks very much for that, Nick. I'm sure we'll come back to you later in the week. But that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. I'll be back again tomorrow night at the usual time. So do please join me then if you can. Until then, bye-bye.